Live streaming is on.
Live streaming is on, guys.
Great.
Have a blast.
How's it going? My name is Jason Jordan. I'm the Assistant Director of Forensics at the University of Utah. You're watching the gold round at the 2020 National Online Collegiate Forensics Festival. Since this debate is going to be between two debaters from the University of Utah, because the two debaters that advanced to the final and gold round of Lincoln Douglas debate were both from the University of Utah. There won't be a judge. This will be an exhibition debate, and I was asked to briefly introduce the round and MC it, so I'll be doing that. Before we begin the debate, I'd be remiss if we didn't thank a couple of people. We at the U, as well as I think I speak for everyone that has been a part of this tournament, are deeply, deeply, deeply thankful for the work of Danny Cantrell and everyone else that has been involved in putting on the National Online Collegiate Forensics Festival. I know that all of us work all year, coaches, students, work all year to celebrate a season by going to a national championship tournament. And all of us were really disheartened when those tournaments all had to be canceled because of the current COVID-19 global pandemic. So we are very, very, very thankful that Danny and everyone else has put this together so that we can celebrate the end of all of the hard work that our students have done this year. This round will be the final round in NFA Lincoln Douglas debate. We'll be debating the 2019-2020 resolution, which is resolved: the United States federal government should implement an energy policy that substantially increases investments in one or more of the following domestic energy sectors: nuclear, hydroelectric, geothermal, wind, solar. Our two debaters on the affirmative from the University of Utah will be Leo Doctorman, and on the negative, also from the University of Utah, will be Thane Z. If you are playing along at home, oftentimes in Lincoln Douglas debate, we use a website called SpeechDrop that you can access by going to speechdrop.net, speechdrop.net. If you go to speechdrop.net and you'd like to see the evidence that the two debaters are passing back and forth, which is common in LD debate, you can do so by entering a room code at speechdrop.net. That room code, I'll say it twice, is little n, little z, little m as in Mary, capital E, little f, capital K. And one more time with feeling: little n, little z, little m as in Mary, capital E, little f, capital K. With that, I will stop talking and let the two folks that have made it to the final round in LD debate do the rest of the talking. So our first speech will be from the affirmative debater, which is Leo Doctorman from the University of Utah.
Hello, everybody. I will begin now. Inherency. Federal tax credits for solar energy were phased out and disproportionately impact poor coalfield communities. This is SCF 19. Federal tax credits for solar energy installations to be phased out over the next few years. By 2023, the solar industry will be strong enough to grow and flourish on its own. It seems far too early to curtail the program. The Hopi and Navajo tribes facing impending closure of power plants or a coal mine that provided revenues critical to government services. The Hopi stand to be especially hit hard. The loss of 80% of general fund revenue. Many of these power plants and mines have historically been key economic drivers. It makes sense now for Congress and Trump administration to work together to minimize the fallout. This would likely bring local and regional benefits by helping to drive new utility-scale solar projects that don't exist yet in most of these areas. Despite the surge in such project development across the U.S. in general. Thus, the plan. We propose that the United States federal government should implement an energy policy that substantially increases investment in solar energy sector by implementing the full federal solar tax credit by 4 years for coalfield communities, funding enforcement through normal means. Here's a solvency card. Extending the tax credit is going to be effective and necessary. Lunt 19. The federal subsidy responsible for billions of dollars has helped jumpstart the U.S. solar industry by giving customers a percentage of the project's cost back against their tax liability, creating hundreds of billions of dollars of private investment, hundreds and thousands of jobs since 2006. A tax policy provided continued stability investment opportunity for solar is critical, which has been renewed multiple times. It is still a deciding factor for many solar sales. My first advantage is indigenous economy. A transition away from coal is inevitable. Bashaum 19. Coal consumption has fallen over 44%. Only 691 million short tons of domestic electricity market, further declining to just 26%. And coal shutdowns disproportionately affect tribal coalfield communities. However, an extension on solar tax energy credits into 2024 solves. SCF 19. Federal tax credits for solar energy installations are on track to be phased out. Behind dialing it back year by year after 2019, by 2023, the solar industry will be strong enough to grow and flourish on its own. Curtailment comes at the worst possible time for vulnerable communities. Solar projects don't yet exist in most of these areas. Extensions would keep the full federal solar tax credit in place longer for communities that have been economically devastated. The impact is colonial domination. Refusal to resolve tribal resilience causes climate injustice and settler domination. The impact is violence and discrimination. White 18. Settler colonial domination can be the undermining of indigenous adaptive capacity or social resilience. A key ecological dimension of such domination, how settler colonial strategies, what I've just described, represents one dimension of how settler colonialism is violence. As an ecological form of domination is environmental violence. It is possible to identify some of the violent patterns of environmental injustice, vicious sedimentation within the pattern of how environmental changes compound over time to reinforce and strengthen settler ignorance. Constant ascriptions of settler ecologies onto indigenous ecologies fortify this settler ignorance. And my second advantage is rural economies. The inevitable decline of coal kills small rural towns. It takes away the only jobs. It cuts tax revenue, and it scatters people to new places. Dennis and Muffson 19. Plants once provided 700 jobs, now latest casualties of declining industry. It has persisted under Trump. Coal can't compete against cheaper alternatives in Adam County, and a coal plant that leaves a void. It's the largest employers. It's lifeblood. Millions of dollars in tax revenue has vanished like wisp of steam from the coal stacks. The local school systems has cut positions. We're talking about several hundred millions of dollars in taxable revenue, but the affirmative solves. Skinulus and Cates, 19. Coalfield communities nationwide are in crisis. Many demographics and locations diversification is driven by innovation and new investment. Extending the federal tax credit for solar energy development in these areas, tax credits are scheduled to be phased out over the next few years. Over time, we will could very well give rise to new regional industry. It is too soon to curtail the program in coal country where solar has not really been given the chance to take root. You can mark the card after root. And coal jobs going into solar is net beneficial. Pierce 18. Profitability for U.S. coal plummeted. Coal employment has dropped. Many skills transferred into the solar industry. Wide variety of employment opportunities in solar. Pays generally better at all levels of education. Make more money in solar industry than they do in coal. The country retains coal miners for solar industry workers themselves win because America wins, and America will win because we will be more economically competitive. And the impact rural poverty is equal to psychological violence. Bassett 2006. In addition to physical distancing, psychological distancing is a factor in rural poverty. Stereotyping creates psychological distancing from everything associated with rural poverty. Poor are seen as outgroups, most severe and persistent rural poverty, which permits discrimination more readily. Characterizing the rural poor as an outgroup creates psychological distancing. Now I'm going to move on to some framing arguments. Dominant policy scholarship and practice ignores rural areas. In the view of policymakers, rural communities don't exist. Porter, 2005. An unspoken assumption permeates scholarships. Impact of law should be measured in terms of how the legal system operates in cities. Rural Americans have disappeared from view. Policymakers discuss economic pressures on family residents. When reform proposals for legislation are debated, rural Americans are ghosts in the legal system. And discussions about renewable policy is the best practice for indigenous communities. Powell 8. We argue that knowledge practices are crucial components of the practice of movements. Heated debates over where native knowledge contributes to environmental justice. When we recognize movements as space and process in which the knowledge are generated, both in politics of those contemporary movements. So the inability to recognize knowledge practices some of the as some of the central works in the movements make it difficult for theorists to grasp the actual political effects. We argue for the need to go beyond the emphasis of determining mechanisms, cognitive praxis that informs all social activity, which we vie with the most basic political institutions. Social studies influenced by strict definitions that reduce the political to be fixed institutional sphere, alter the what for of social movement research, epistemological significance, and political stakes. Mark the card after stakes.
Alrighty. Ready, Leo?
I sure am.
Okay, cool. So what's a federal solar tax credit and how does it work?
So the basic idea of how they work is when, in this specific instance, a solar company decides to open in a coalfield community, i.e. any community where the majority of workers are currently employed by the coal industry or were employed by the coal industry in the past. It pretty much incentivizes through tax cuts for these companies for them to move to these regions.
Okay, cool. So what is colonial domination, and why did you include it in your first advantage just for the white 2018 evidence?
We have a very specific definition of colonial domination, and our evidence is very specific as to how we must challenge it through political means. But I think in this instance, what we mean by colonial domination is the sort of political ignorance that a lot of scholarship and academia has towards indigenous communities. And my white card, as well as my SDF evidence, which comes from indigenous folks who are sort of talking about the best ways to push back against these things, thinks that our affirmative is a good step towards taking these systems out.
Okay, that makes sense to me. So how did, I guess, actually, yeah, I want to ask that question. So you read this piece of evidence near the framework page of your case, this Porter 05 evidence. Yeah. What is this card's importance to this debate?
For sure. So the basic premise is that in academia, in scholarship, in politics, really in almost any area, rural communities are sort of sidelined and viewed as not as important. As Porter describes it, they are ghosts in the legal system. I think that just the very act of having this discussion is probably a good knowledge production and epistemologically good, if you will.
Okay, cool. What is epistemology?
It's the basic theory of knowledge. In this context, it's how we create knowledge, the things, and come to the conclusions of things that we know.
Okay, cool. Makes sense to me. So you talk about on your first advantage, you talk about how there's an inevitable sort of decline of coal. What does that decline look like, and how long will it take?
Yeah, so
a rough estimate.
So it's difficult to predict how long it's going to take. I think that the evidence indicates that it is falling very quickly. It kind of depends how fast investment leaves it. But the premise is that over the next probably decade, the vast majority of these communities are going to be out of work.
Okay, cool. Makes sense to me. And last question. What does it mean to, what is praxis in regard to your PAL 5?
For sure, yeah. Praxis is the way we sort of activate agency, the way that we do things to create change. It's sort of the more tangible actions that a person can take.
Right on. Okay, speech doc is up. The order is going to be one off-case position, and then the first advantage and the second advantage. Alrighty, we're gonna get going. Good, Leah?
Yes.
Okay, sweet. The critique. The affirmative's dependency on state action and the use and the ideals to solve for the problems they seek to avoid rely on the grandiose narrative of colonialism. McDonald 2005 explains, before 1942, Americans were not on anybody's map. Interest and access to live in America. America was never discovered. America was an invention in colonial expansion, appropriation and integration of the continent into the imaginary. Discovery and invention belong to two different paradigms. The geopolitics of knowledge colonialization is the producing the idea that certain people do not belong to history. Coloniality is difficult to recognize. The invention of America was a true turning point to history. Coloniality towards domination, progress, modernization, and being good for everybody. But the United States, the same logic was maintained. Only the power changed hands. Now, how does this link to the F? Two links. Number one, the discourse of global universal human action to solve for the environmental catastrophe they seek to avoid is only the newest attempt at bolstering the grand narrative of coloniality. Schwartz in 17 explains, considering the unequal distribution of anthropogenic changes, it's become clear that the undifferent notion of the human kind as a new geological age is inadequate to describe the politics and injustices of capitalist development. Western expressions of still mark their historically situated lines of inequality according to categories such as species, gender, race, class, ability, or sexual orientation. These material semiotic practices of ordering also define how biosocial relations are protected and performed. The police in every life. It is problematic that debates about the sustainability continue to be dominated by troubling separation between realm of science and the realm of political. A complex political economy could not be sufficiently understood unless one realizes the Western section narratives of single bond turning are characterized by willful obstructions. We can see sediments of powerful mythical narratives of human mastery from the matter of the subject, from the object, the nature of the culture. A number of scientists suggest the Anthropocene should be seen as an opportunity. The myths of the geoengineer are only fallacies of control. Second link. The backbone of technology, the affirmative science, is only valuable within the inframing of colonialist ideology. The way they say this tech is good only allows for more control, as they are the ones that issue it. Escobar 12. The faith in science and technology, such as nuclear physics operations, play an important role in the elaboration and justification for the new discourse of development. The development of the country depends primarily on a material factor, the knowledge and the exploitation. The technology has been marked of civilization per excellence since the 19th century. When machines become an index of civilization, this modern trait was rekindled with the advent of the development age. Technology was believed not only to amplify material progress, it would also confer upon the self-direction and significance. The sociology of modernization technology was theorized as part of the moral focus that would operate by creating an ethic of innovation. Impacts. First, it's the root cause of all violence. Coloniality is the root cause of all violence. Ladino and Torres 2008 explains, the colony serves as the testing ground for influence of modernity, revealing the darkest secret of the coloniality of Eurocentralism that allows for the state of exception to continue. The modern function of colonial power can be understood as naturalization, killability, and rivalry, are inscribed in the images of colonial bodies. The same ideas that inspire acts of war, legitimizing modernity, a process that naturalizes death as war. Now, the alternative is to reject the affirmative to engage in epistemic disobedience. The alternative is to reject the affirmative to engage in epistemic disobedience against the truth claims of the AC. Rejecting both the usefulness of the benevolent state action and epistemes of colonialism are key to practice decoloniality. McDonald 12 explains, it is necessary to extricate oneself from the linkage between rationality, modernity, and coloniality. Epistemic disobedience leads us to a decolonial option. Delinking is necessary because there is no way out of the colonial power from within Western thought. Delinking implies epistemic disobedience. Disobedience takes us to a different beginning. Decolonial thinking delinks the possibility hidden within modern rationality. I'm not going to read the Dean on this card right now, so I'm going to skip to the next McDonald card. And highlighting and critiquing individual practices of coloniality is key to denaturalizing Western epistemologies. McDonald 12. Decolonial thinking is each knot of the web. A point of delinking and opening the reintroduces the language, memories, and economics of social organization subjectivities. Our present situation demands decolonial thinking that articulates genealogies scattered throughout the planet and offers other economic, political, social, subject modalities and the framework. As a communication scholar, endorse the debater that best engages in decoloniality. You have an obligation to consider the epistemic violence of coloniality first. The method of the NC is a better form of scholarship than traditional policymaking, i.e. the F. Wasner 12. We all must become decolonial rhetoricians rather than be at the service of colonial philosophy. We must adopt a decolonial attitude. Shifting the geography is written. Ethical decolonial love requires that those who benefit from epistemic violence engage in such forms of practice that can be overrun to protect and negotiate the borderlands. It is crucial. We wish to do more than perpetuate a permanent state of exception that dehumanizes people of color, maintaining totalizing exclusionary episteme. Now we'll be addressing their case, specifically on Advantage 1. So first and foremost, solar is bad for these areas. Turn in no solvency. Solar doesn't work and it harms the environment and leads to toxic waste in their communities. Rug 19. Energy has significant of the environment disadvantage. Solar farms send ripples throughout the ecosystem. The environment could become less livable for plants and wildlife. So vegetation growth farms the impact of birds loss of the nesting site, food sources, and the emission of the stages of solar. It is important to know the production of the process. It begins with the mining, the ores utilization, the equipment, and the transporting the fuel and electricity. Quartz has been housed with materials. According to solar, is a very intensive process. Solar cells contain toxic metal chemicals. Solar won't be able to produce electricity at night. Solar system will provide little output. Panels end up in e-waste dumps. Solar panels create their own and more times toxic waste. Think about Chernobyl. They read this white card, but this white card doesn't even talk about policy engagement, which means they don't access the impact. Seriously, look at the card. It doesn't say anything about the state. I'm not going to read that McDonald 5 card. Go to Advantage 2. Turn. Rare earths are being researched and developed now for better and safer alternative. American Chernobyl Society 2012. Rare earth elements are being difficult to attain. Science have identified magnets based on really attainable rare earths, such as the magnets that don't contain these minerals at all. New ways to make good magnets experimentally can rehabilitate systems. We start with the alloy. The materials higher iron and cobalt by allowing alloys paradigms have been confirmed with additive CO5 could be used to place in the strongest rare earth magnets. So easing demand for those elements would be ideal economically and environmentally. Our goal is to match the right magnet to a specific application. For example, the use of cobalt, the performance of the iron and germanium. The common time magnet with this strategy is being applied to other rare earth compounds. And the increase and demand for technology manufacturing of things like solar causes a massive spike of rare earth mining. Chan 19. Vehicles and batteries means more for materials. Sorry, more solar and turbines. Yeah, supply chain like the lithium and cobalt for batteries. We made this 90% of the world new when it comes out of China. Bottom line for is funding a loads of rare earth exportation just slow down if we don't get investment as demand increases. So as we come into the market, it's difficult to find larger projects with a massive renewable energy infrastructure. And demands for rare earth mining are soaring as more renewable energy is being pursued. Suyowski in 2019. weighing trade-offs between mining the environment and the sensitive areas and sourcing metals. It's likely that become common if countries continue generating renewable energy to put electric car grids fully powered. A rush to meet the demand could lead to more mining with telex safety regulations. And that destroys small rural villages. Turn to the case. Vote neg. Sue 19. They are called rare earths because their obstruction project is toxic. China has become dominant. Oh, I'm reading the yellow, my bad. Has become dominant. The results are mineral trees and poison water have caused disease in cattle villages. Unprovidence residents cannot afford to move. Crops and animals have protests have been at risk. Villages resisted the company's attempt to mine from earth. Right place to confront the crowd with the batons beating up villagers. They have no choice but live in contaminated areas. Rural residents demand and unwilling to invest in more environmentally responsible mining are drivers of China's harmful practices.
Are good to go?
Yeah.
Sweet. Communication scholars engage in political discussions.
If you're talking about the framework card, which is how I argue we should sort of evaluate this debate, I would say that it's important to highlight the specific instances of coloniality. So your question kind of assumes that the framework, doesn't exist. So from a sort of non-framework perspective, I'm sure they are capable of, but I'm arguing they should not because.
Okay, I don't believe your card makes any warrant for why they can't. So what bad knowledge does the affirmative produce?
Come again?
What bad knowledge does the affirmative produce?
Yeah, so there's sort of two links. One is a society of sort of universal environmental regulation. The sort of framing of coloniality has been used to control.
We don't do environmental regulation.
You definitely do. Solar, you increase sort of.
Solar's inevitable. Our app is about where solar goes. What is the alternative to the United States?
What's the alternative?
Yeah,
well, I don't think I have to answer that question. This begs a question of a framework. I think that it's important for us to evaluate the way that knowledge is produced. It kind of goes back to what you said in cross-examination of the AC, that it's important for us to highlight the way that epistemology sort of impact us. And I'm saying that, in a world of the alternative, we'd be able, it's a question about how we orient our subjectivities within the space of debate.
Our subjectivity should be ignoring objective reality that the U.S. exists.
It's again, you take the K out of context. I have cards that talk about why, as communication scholars within academic spaces, that's important.
Are science and medicine epistemic modernity?
The way the U.S. controls them, yeah.
Okay, checks out. I guess. Could you just go a little bit more in depth on what the link is? Because I'm just trying to explain why it's probably necessary to give these people what they're demanding. I don't quite understand what the link is.
Well, I think there's sort of two. One is the Shoal 17 card, the sort of idea of universal human action, right? The idea of the sort of linear progress of sort of technology is the same justification that the United States has used in order to sort of further colonialist domination. Yeah. So your sort of narrative of, we can walk down the sunset and sing Kumbaya together, it's probably not accurate. Do
indigenous, do the narratives of indigenous communities have a place in epistemic disobedience?
That's not the point. The point is that, that's just not what the alternative is. It's not like the alt is rejecting. Well, the alternative is to refuse it's to refuse to engage in the acceptance that the sort of epistemes of your affirmative. Pretty good.
Let me just upload the document. Sweet, there we go. I will begin. It is morally indefensible to allow the structural ignorance and economic Darwinism of current energy policy. The collapse of coal has eliminated certain bodies from environmental futurity. The extension of the solar credits will enshrine the development of solar within these communities. Two arguments. First of all, solar is inevitable, but credits have historically been a decider of where these solar fields go. For instance, it's a determination of whether they put them by a big city or where indigenous communities can actually pocket that money. The elimination of these credits means that solar fields open near cities rather than areas that actually need it. Secondarily, credits are being cut and reduced now, but many solar companies are 4 years out from becoming established in these places, so getting rid of these would probably be a bad idea because they might move away. On my first advantage, so first of all, I just want to kind of group all of the like REM stuff and the solar is bad. It's not a question of if solar happens, it's a question of where. Because we're already past the tipping point, solar is more secure investment long-term than natural gas or coal. This is Papadopoulos 19. A pair of reports released this week by Rocky Mountain Institute, a nonprofit promotion of transition from away from fossil fuels, offered some of the very positive news that renewable energy in the United States. The study revealed that the industry will overtake natural gas power plants within 16 years, a tipping point. The analysis presents compelling evidence that in 2019 represents tipping point. RMI wrote in the report, with economics now favoring clean energy over nearly all the U.S. gas-fired generation. According to the institute, there will be expansive to run 90% of natural gas-fired power plants to build wind and solar farm energy storage by 2035, or hard after 2035. So I think it's not a question of if these things happen; they're already increasing. This is also presented in my Lund evidence as well as my SEF evidence. It's more of a question of where they go. So a little bit more on the line by line on the advantages. Native groups are sort of depend on new industry for resiliency and survival, and it's what they are asking for. For instance, coal industry money provides 80% of Hopi revenue and the vast majority of their jobs. The affirmative is an act of radical empowerment to provide these communities with a way to escape these cycles of poverty and violence through putting them on the cutting edge of solar technologies. On my second advantage, in potentially where there was not terribly much refutation from my opponent, these rural communities are rendered invisible in modern politics. My Porter card is very specific on how these discussions always get sidelined in terms of both theory and politics, and the affirmative is required to bring them new industries that combat the psychological violence of economic isolation. With that, I will move on to the criticism. The role of the ballot is political engagement via testing the affirmative versus the consequences of the negative. You have to reject their nebulous frameworks that destroy policymaking, to which is key for agency and simulation. This destroys policymaking and makes being affirmative impossible because every AF would just lose to a different negative framework. But I want to provide just a little bit of an introduction to what this debate is probably going to look like, and potentially give a little framing for why I'm going to be ahead on it, because it's going to be a question of what epistemology the affirmative creates and why it is better than the K. I will tell you that we are a positive discussion about what indigenous communities actually want, not what academics in the ivory tower think they want. And I would say the demands are good in academic spaces. We present a political basis for criticism of state action in the formulation of specific policy demands for activists to use. For example, the Young Lords were a Puerto Rican activist group in New York in the 70s, and they used policy debate to determine their own thinking, and then they used that to determine what their activism was. So I think that we're probably an internal link to better discussions. And I think that it's also key that we debate about what we have to debate about the research that we have and what is the best method to improve these systems. And I will tell you that the affirmative is best because it endorses specific indigenous hardships and it specifically tells you how to solve them. I think that it was always going to be net better than, sort of nebulous criticisms of the United States, because for a lot of people, that is the reality of their lives, and the U.S. isn't going to disappear because we wish it does, even though I don't think most people wish it does. We provide the best discourse for forming specific pragmatic solutions, arming activists with facts that don't ignore objective reality. Let's go on to the K proper. Because I'm running a little low on time, let me do this first. First of all, different strategies for different people. Different people can engage in discussions of what they need better. I think that overgeneralizing is probably bad. And here's do both. This is Bogos 12. If a physician practices medicine, a metaphysician ought to be someone who practices ontology. One ought not to trust a metaphysician who had only read books about nature, the universe, without entering into it and doing it. The basic thrust of import feminology is likely to be misunderstood at the least, or missed at the most knowledgeable. your labor are not opposites, but two sides of the same coin. You can mark the card after coin, and this is an indite of the sort of theory of the affirmative when it doesn't engage in the more real situations that Indigenous communities are actually asking for. So on the first Mignolo card, I think it would be incorrect to assume that there is not some reliance on the state for every single individual, especially those who are not privileged, to detach ourselves when U.S. services are literally their strategy for survival. I think that we use the state to create a better world, and colonialism is not going to disappear, and the way that we formulate our ideas should be in demand, because that is what activists can use, because nobody takes you seriously in the real world if you yell about epistemic disobedience. I think that his Schultz card probably not a link, because we're not about the environment, but I will turn the other link, because we challenge modernity by giving in to Indigenous demands and what they're actually asking for. And finally, on to the alternative, epistemic disobedience. I do not think that epistemic disobedience puts food on the table. I don't think it accomplishes anything. I think that it is a way to detach ourselves from objective reality, and the permutation is probably a better way to account for how all people want to engage in the real world.
Alrighty. Nice, Leo. Let's put this document up and get this show on the road. There's only one card in there. Okay. The order for the interested parties is going to be the criticism, the ruralism advantage, and then the curse advantage. All right, good to go? Okay, cool. Critique, not going to go for kicking the K, which means I am no longer advocating for the K in this debate. Any offense that Leo read against me on this flow should not be used against me in the 2AR. Now, why is kicking the argument or the ability to have a conditional advocacy good? Conditionality is good. 1, education, argumentation, and innovation. It's obvious that the real-world politics are always tested from multiple different angles. Being able to defend your case from all angles is key to proper and real-world discourse. It proves Kondo as independent good outside this round. 2, negative flexibility outweighs affirmative flexibility. The affirmative gets the first and the last speech. They get infinite prep time because they get the first speech, and they also get to control the locus of the debate. 1AR sandbags, time key distinctions are my ground is necessary and reactionary based on what the affirmative does. Obviously, conditionality is critical to allow the negative to have flexibility. Also, conditionality is key to information processing. Argument introduction fosters information processing and strategic decision-making by allowing initial testing to determine which propositions require in-depth review. That's the best middle ground between breadth and depth, and teaches priority setting and high-pressure decision-making, which are portable advocacy skills. 2 options are uniquely better because it allows, or 1 option, conditional, is uniquely better than nothing because it allows you to consider the interaction between different advocacies. It also teaches nuances. Ideological diverse arguments force the affirmative to defend the political middle ground. If it's true that practice is good as per their arguments versus the K, then you should evaluate this ability to take arguments as such because we're always seeking better information, and conditionality is key to argument innovation. Debaters are naturally risk adverse, so if we're forced to only go to 1 conditional, 0 conditional options, we'll kick it with what we know best. Conditionality encourages testing new ideas and matters. It's key to critical thinking and education by expanding the scope of arguments. I am exposed to flexibility, and the internal link turns any education claims they might make as to why conditionality is bad. It means debate becomes stale without conditionality. Now I will go to their first advantage. So at the top of the page, I will concede their Porter 2005 evidence, which means if I control the link portion of this flow, it means it's game over for the affirmative. Let me means what this means. Let me explain what my evidence and my articulation of their arguments means in the context of the affirmative. Because the Porter 2005 evidence is really, really good, and I'm conceding it. It means you need to center your decision around who creates a better vision for rural communities specifically, which means even if they win a substantial risk of their first advantage, which I'll indict later, it means that you can vote negative in order to delay the amount of rare earth metals from being researched in the status quo. Even if the solar tax credit thing happens in the future, you can functionally vote negative because they conceded the uniqueness card. The ACS 2019 evidence that says rare earth metals are being currently developed right now for newer and safer alternatives. What this means, judges, is when you vote for the affirmative, there's going to be a massive increase in demand in solar energy and cause bad rare earth metal mining. This is the Chen 2019 evidence, which is very, very specific. What happens when we mine rare earth metals in these areas? It means they usually end up on rural communities. Things like groundwater gets poisoned. factories get built onto areas, and it decimates the ecosystems and the environment of these areas. Now, when Leo gets up here and says it's a really, really small area of people, you have to remember that the United States is currently really, really low on rare earth metals. What this means is any tiny, tiny risk or an increase of solar materials means it increases REM or rare earth metal research massively and causes a massive spike in demand. This means that factories, mines, etc., are built in and around rural communities to mine, and the harm of this comes with the fact that these areas usually have these factories usually have really, really bad regulation. They poison the water, they do things like kill the environment, and so on and so on. What this means, as per the 2019 evidence, what this means is that by voting for the affirmative, you're actually contra to what the affirmative wants to do. And if it's true that we should evaluate this debate based on rural communities, then voting for the negative to prevent the mass suffering of rural communities is the only thing that matters at the end of this debate. And I am not going to read the card I sent Leo, so don't worry about that. Yeah, I mean, basically all the offense Leo said on this, he basically said there wasn't a lot of offense, but that's just not true. I think this sort of terminal link turn is really, really good as to why they're actually anti-intuitive to what they want to do. They'll say it results in psychological distancing. It's not psychological distancing. This evidence is highly specific to rural towns. I'm increasing them in the political discussion, and it's necessary and good to include them. I'll agree, but I've proven why you are actually anti-intuitive. Therefore, it's sort of not a voting issue. And because the Porter evidence has gone conceded, I will say this again, Judge, because the Porter evidence has gone conceded, Leo has to go for this argument, because otherwise he's going to be contrary to himself when he goes for this indigenous epistemology argument, which I'll indict. Now, on to the first advantage. So at the top, they say it's not a question of solar is bad. It absolutely is. By voting for the affirmative, you increase the amount of solar in these communities. I've read a piece of evidence which he has zero sort of articulation outside of saying that's not the question, but the piece of evidence indicates, the Right 19 evidence indicates that solar waste gets dumped into these areas. I mean, it's true as per his White 18 evidence that colonialism is very real. These indigenous communities will probably get the waste from solar and dumped on them, the waste from solar dumped on them as well, which proves that he's also continually anti-intuitive to what he wants to do. Furthermore, they say this White 2018 evidence, and they'll probably say it's able to resolve a lot of the harms. But once again, I articulated my index on this, that number one, it never actually says the state within this White 2018 evidence. This White 2018 evidence just says that colonialism is bad, obviously. But the critical question is, how does a policy implication resolve that? They've never been able to explain that. What this means is that you can no longer, out of this White 2018 evidence, they don't access this impact. And also, they'll say that like energy policy is flexible as for the SCF 2019 evidence. This SCF evidence is just a glorified solvency advocate. It doesn't make anything special. The first advantage doesn't have a link in it. They'll say that the transition from coal away is inevitable. That's great. I don't have to win that it's not inevitable. All I have to win is that there's research happening in the status quo, that if you vote negative to delay the amount of rare earths happening, it won't destroy these rural towns, which is what we should be focusing on as per his own Porter 5 evidence. Thank you very much.
Cool. The order is going to be let's see. Sorry. The order is going to be an overview and then the case. I have all of 3 minutes to do it. I will begin. We are going to win because the uniqueness on the REM term is the uniqueness will terminally always overwhelm the link, and the concession of many different cards that explain that will probably be in that I will win this round. Let me go through all of them. Solar is going to increase at a linear pace. This is why Lund explains that it is an investment. The investments are already high and it's only increasing. In fact, up until about 4 months ago, there was solar credits, much like the affirmative, everywhere else that increased solar exponentially and has set it in motion. I think that my Papadopoulos evidence explains that solar is at the tipping point. It is already on a trajectory where, because it is now cheaper than things like coal and natural gas, it has been set in motion to be the new mode of energy production. And I think that my SCF evidence specifically explains that solar increases everywhere except where it's actually needed. So I think that whether or not the affirmative happens, solar is inevitably going to exist in a capacity that is probably quite linear. The difference between the affirmative and the status quo is that where these solar farms exist, where they are opened, and who they benefit. I think that I will win this debate insofar as I have won the question of whether or not the affirmative is a good idea. That's the framing question of this round. I win because on balance, the affirmative acts as a positive idea. It is true. This is a true fact, a true uncontested fact that without investment that leaders of native NGOs from all over the country have asked for, a lot of these communities will not have the funding to exist within the next 10 years. For example, the Hopi tribe has already lost 80% of their funding. That is a massive amount of funding, and I believe that it is probably an important thing to, as I explained on the criticism, to listen to these leaders, something that very often does not happen enough. And so this becomes a question of if the affirmative can solve, and if it can solve, does the REM turn in solar being bad outweigh? I will tell you that no, the REM and solar turns do not outweigh, for first of all, because they are probably an inevitability, but even if we increase it fractionally, I do not think that it is that important to focus on these sort of fractional criticisms in a world where indigenous communities are facing, especially rural and indigenous communities are facing an impending doom because they do not have the funding to continue the services that their people need, and it will further push them into poverty. I believe that it is best that we listen to these people and what they want, and we realize that solar REM is probably an inevitability, so we have to focus on what will best help these people.
Great, and that was the gold round, the final round in NFA-LD at the 2020 National Online Collegiate Forensics Festival. Congratulations again to the two debaters that made it to this final round. On the affirmative, Leo Docterman from the University of Utah, and on the negative, Thane Z from the University of Utah. We hope you've enjoyed this debate. We hope everyone is staying safe throughout the ongoing global pandemic.
Oh, it's delayed. They got us.
Wait,
Oh my gosh. Dude,
Can
someone did.
Can we close?
Yeah. Oh, wait. Yeah, give me a call, dude.